Eureka we're actually brewing today, so I'll go through the steps of the brewing process real quick. So here is our what's called the brew house. This is the essentially the cooking part of the beer making process, where things are hot. They're either boiling or hot water, things like that. So you start off with a silo of grain or a grist case. It's milled and you transfer it into your first vessel, which is your mash slaughter tun. So this is the mash slaughter tun. It's actually full right now. Like I said, we're brewing. What happens in this vessel is you mix milled grain with warm water. And the purpose of that is to make what's called a mash. And in that mash, the starches from your grain actually get converted into sugars. And sugars is what you want for the beer making process, because sugar is what eventually turns into alcohol. So that's what we're going for. So the grain comes in very just bready and bland. After it sits in its mash, it actually turns intensely sweet, like syrupy sweet. And that's just chemistry happening, those starches turning into sugars. After all those starches have been converted into sugars, you have a big oatmeal-y kind of mess, and all you really want is just the liquid part. So you have to extract the liquid from the solids. That's called the lauter. And that's what we're actually currently doing right now. So we're pulling the clean liquid out from the mash and leaving all those solids, that grain material behind. And that good, sugary, clean liquid is called wort, W-O-R-T. That's what we're collecting in our kettle. So we have the grain getting left behind in the mash slaughter tun. We're gradually filling our kettle. Once the kettle's full, that's kind of what everyone recognizes as the brewing process, which is the boil, where you have a rolling boil going in your kettle. At that point is where the hops would be added. You can also add other things like spices, depending on what beer you're making. If you're making an IPA, there's gonna be a ton of hops going in at that point. Boil usually around 60 minutes. Add, like I said, hops, maybe spices. After that, it was nice and clear, but you just added a ton more stuff like the hops. Now you need to separate it again. And the way we separate it in the kettle is what's called a whirlpool, where we get the liquid spinning like a whirlpool. All the solids collect to the center and drop out, and then you can actually pull the liquid off and leave all those hop materials and anything else behind. So after the whirlpool, we're pulling out of the kettle. We're going into our heat exchanger now, because boiling is 212 Fahrenheit. We need to get it down to, if it's an ale, we're looking at about 70 degrees. So we turn the liquid from 212 to 70 on its way to one of our fermenters. And these are our 3 fermenters. This is what's called the cool side of brewing, or the fermentation, or sometimes referred to as the cellar. And this is where the actual sugary water wort turns into real beer. So we transfer into one of our fermenters. At that point, we add yeast once the wort is nice and cool. And the yeast go to town on that sugary, basically yeast food that we just made for them. 2 main things they make are alcohol, but they also make CO2. So during the fermentation process, there'll be a ton of CO2 coming out of the tank, but eventually you're gonna want that CO2 to be in your beer. So there are techniques to actually capture the CO2 that the yeast make to carbonate your beer. If you choose not to do that, another way is to just inject CO2 into the beer, and you can carbonate it that way. So if you use the yeast to make your carbonation, it's called natural carbonation. If you use just like compressed CO2 to do it, it's called forced carbonation. So one of those 2 techniques will be used, and that's how you carbonate a beer. When that's all done, you have beer. I hope you enjoyed our little explanation. If you're really interested, try homebrewing. It's a great hobby, and thank you.